Hi, Sean Kidney back again. This time, following on from the discussion I've just had of John Morton, counsellor to US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and note that what John said in that is it's the first time this has been a counsellor, and his job is to elevate climate change across all aspects of US Treasury policy and activity. Incredibly important. How common is this kind of role? It's very exciting. This session is about the green window, geopolitical alignment on climate between the major economies. You know, for the last 30 years, we've been hammering away at trying to get global agreements between 200 countries roughly in the world. And it's tough. It's been tough. Helped by, well, rather impeded by a lot of foot dragging by rich economies who might talk of one thing and not actually do, etc., etc. But we have something special this year. And is this a pandemic outcome with people realising the risks of not listening to your scientists and not acting quickly? Or is it just the natural evolution of the argument with civic society and progressive forces beginning to win the argument? I don't know. All I know is that early this year, we found ourselves in an extraordinary moment with the majority of the world's economies committing to aggressive 2030 targets. And it's important to note 2030 targets are what count. 2050 net zero are useful, but for the lives of most politicians, that can be done in the 2040s. A bit like some of the corporate 2050 targets that we've seen, which involve not much business change in the next 10 years, and then they eventually get to it in 2040. Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says it can't work that way. We need to get, on average globally, 50% emission reductions by 2030 to be able to have a chance of being able to then reach our 2050 targets. It's the next few years that count. So now we have Europe. You heard this morning from Meredith McGuinness, the Commissioner of DG Fiscal Finance for Europe, talking about the 55% by 2030 target. We've had President Biden commit to the 50% cuts by 2030 target. We've had President Xi Jinping commit to 2030 carbon neutrality and 2030 peak emissions and 2060 carbon neutrality, but also commitments by the leaders of Japan, South Korea, the UK, and Canada and many other countries. Of course, the truth is no one knows really how to get there. But suddenly it's in a political lifetime of leaders that will probably still be around, still be serving at the time, becomes real and more substantive. It raises an opportunity which has been very difficult for us to raise, especially in the last 4 years, with, let's call it, divergent views on climate change around the world, which is of getting the major economies in sync on aggressive 2030 targets. What would happen? Could we do this? How would it work? We have a great panel today to discuss that subject. But first, I've got to do a couple of housekeeping measures. I have to remind you all, this whole event is here because of our sponsors. We are deeply thankful to JP Morgan as our global sponsor, to Credit Suisse, Ping An Asset Management Ping An of China Asset Management to be precise, but Ping An being the largest insurer in the world, Moody's, Luxembourg Green Exchange, Citi, and a fantastic interview by Val Smith that we aired on Monday. You should have a look at that, as well as the interview of Chuka Umunna from JP Morgan. Really useful. And Sean Chang from Ping An, which will play a little later today. Refinity of BNP Paribas, IHS Market, Allianz Bernstein, FSD Africa, and the other sponsors. We're very grateful, deeply grateful. A couple of housekeeping issues. You can ask questions. I can't promise we're going to capture your questions in the live event, although I am scanning. So have a go. And anything that we can, we'll also try and attempt to answer in the text. So please do use the Q&A box to ask questions. Everything else goes to chat. Note the live interpretations. We need to add Japanese to this team because we've got live interpretations thanks to Mizuho Bank happening right now and for all of tomorrow, as well as Portuguese, Spanish, Mandarin and French. All the sessions are being recorded. You can listen till November. Use the cool tools to network and meet other people and ask questions. Our whole Climate Bonds team is on the app answering questions should you have any. Send me a message if you like, and I'll have a shot at answering it too. And then if you're a media, well, look, we live or die on the part of good coverage, sensible coverage, intelligent coverage of this issue. We need you. Please ask for help or an interview if you need it. Today in this session, we have a few cool speakers. Let me run you through the crowd we've got with us today. Paulina Dejmek, who's a director of DG FISMA, essentially the Ministry of Finance for the European Commission, is with us. She's got an illustrious history. She's looking at the international dimensions of financial work. She'll tell us a bit more about that when she comes in. She used to work in the cabinets of Michel Barnier when he was a commissioner, and Jean-Claude Juncker when he was president of the Commission as an economic advisor. And a little twist, she was director of the Commission's UK negotiations task force. So interesting stories are writing up. We're not going to ask her about those stories now. But she's been central in many of the policy discussions in Europe in recent years. We have my old friend Rathin, who's the CEO of the Overseas Development Institute, which is an independent global think tank that grew out of the UK government and is still significant funding from the UK government. But he's also a significant figure in what I'm going to call the international and the Indian economic policy apparatus. He was a long-time director of the National Institute for Public Finance Policy, which is a think tank created by an act of Parliament in India, serving the states and the centre. He's worked at UNDP as a policy advisor, and he was also a member of the Economic Advisory Council of Prime Minister Modi for some years. Then we're privileged to have Jiang, who's vice president of the Centre for International Knowledge on Development at the Development Research Centre of the State Council. You may not know what the State Council is. It's the cabinet, essentially. It's the cabinet of China. So the State Council is a critically important body, and the Development Research Centre provides them with core advice. Think of it as the Chief Administration Authority, the Research Centre for that. She's also, though, co-leader for Green Development and South-South Cooperation, the Green Belt and Road Coalition. You may know that China's emerging markets engagement on capital flows, infrastructure development and so on is called Belt and Road. China's representative on the UNOSSE, which is the Organisation for South-South Cooperation, South-South Global Thinkers Network. She's a founder of the Silk Road Think Tank Network and Executive Secretary General of the Sustainable Development Forum. As you would expect, a very strong emphasis on an understanding, a deep understanding of development issues in emerging markets. And by the way, if we get cooperation between the major economies to drive change, we need to understand that the bulk of investment to be made in the next 30 years, if we are to achieve the transition to a clean, green society, which I believe it will be in emerging markets. 70% of the capital expenditure that we'll be making on creating clean, green cities, infrastructure, economies and societies will be in emerging markets. And this engagement for emerging markets is really critical. It's one of the reasons we're lucky to have Leslie Maasdorp with us today. He's the Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank. You might know this as the BRICS Bank, the bank that has its initial shareholders as Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. And a few new shareholders that have just joined, that have been announced recently. Leslie, I'm sure, will tell us. Leslie's had a background, well, first initially in ANC activism, in anti-apartheid activism, which is where he started, and then after the change of regime, and the critically important, I'm going to say the inspiring change of regime in South Africa when we saw the collapse of apartheid. He then moved to a series of roles, Deputy Director General of Public Enterprises, involved in privatisation and rationalisation of companies, and then Vice Chair of Barclays Capital and Managing Director of Bank of America Merrill Lynch in South Africa, before he moved to New Development Bank. And I have to say, Leslie, congratulations. You just had your second term as CFO renewed at the New Development Bank. So we'll be talking about these issues for many years to come, I hope. That's the background. That's the panel. I would like to, whoops, I've pushed the slide up a bit too far. I would like to move now to discussion. We've got some opportunities here, right? We've got all these major economies of the world looking at 2030 targets. Paulina, I'd like to start with you. You know, Europe has taken a really strong leadership position with its next gen, and we've heard the green bond announcement just a couple of days ago by the European Commission announcing the beginning of a 225 billion euro program of issuance of green bonds that'll be consistent with Europe's target activities and funding state action. We've got the action plan on sustainable finance, the international platform of sustainable finance. This morning, we heard about the common ground taxonomy that the European Commission is working on with China to provide to the rest of the world as a guidance towards green. There's a lot happening. I want to ask you, though, about the next stage. We've seen the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism proposal, which is going to take a while to come through on one side of it. But how do you see the cooperative agenda going through, the extent to which we might be able to have deeper cooperation between the major economies of the world to drive this change? And of course, my premise is, look, if we get the four major economies of the world, which includes China, Rathin, and India, because India's been absent lately because it's been caught up in a really bad bout of COVID. And I have to say, my friend Rathin is just recovering from COVID himself, so we're very lucky to have him here. If we get these four countries going, surely game over. We can just achieve the change. Paulina, what are the opportunities?
Thank you very much, Sean. And I was about to say good afternoon to Europe, but of course, depending on where you are, good evening or good morning. And I hope you hear me well.
Beautifully.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you also, Sean, for this very, I think, very useful framing of the debate, and of course for your enthusiasm as ever about this subject, which is very, very important. I know that you have heard Commissioner McGuinness this morning, but I still wanted to recall very briefly what Europe has been doing, and then of course putting the emphasis very much on the international cooperation going forward. So first of all, I think probably stating the obvious, which is that Europe has a very ambitious agenda when it comes to the whole fighting the climate crisis agenda. That's been the case for a couple of years already, actually. But obviously, we have stepped up this recently, and it's already been mentioned, the context of the EU Green Deal, and also, as Sean referred to, our recent package with a number of measures which basically aim to help us reducing net emissions by 55% by 2030. That is very ambitious, but I think at the same time that there is no way around that. This is what we have to do. That's why it's a very high priority of European Commission President von der Leyen, and of course the entire team here. Now, what we did already back in 2018 was that we published our first sustainable finance action plan. And I'm mentioning that because I think that is still, if you wish, the building block or the backbone of the policy that we are rolling out as we speak. And that action plan is based on three, I believe, very important elements. The first one being the so-called taxonomy. I'm sure we will speak more about that. I will get back to it, and Sean mentioned it already also. Now, taxonomy is a bit of a sometimes maybe confusing word, but what this is all about is to have this classification system which helps investors, which helps project promoters to basically channel investment into to help the green transition. So that's the first element. Then we have the second element, which is not least important, and that is of course everything which has to do with transparency and disclosure. This, in a way, is probably as fundamental as a taxonomy. We, clients, investors, everyone needs to know where funding is actually heading to. And that's why we believe that having a very robust and very far-reaching and ambitious disclosure framework is so important. We have rules in place in Europe, and we have actually very recently proposed an update to these rules to make them even more comprehensive and cover all the important actors in the economy. And then we have the third element, if you wish, which is the what we would refer to as labeling and green products. I think that's important for many reasons. The green bonds were mentioned. I think Europe is already leading in the world when it comes to being the originators of green bonds. I think that is really the way to go. It's also, I think, the green labels in general is helpful for investors, it's helpful for consumers. Of course, you cannot only have labels, you need to have very strict rules around the labels, because if not, you will very quickly find yourself in the problems of greenwashing. Green is trendy, so to speak, and we need to have a lot of rules, a lot of transparency to make sure that what is labeled as green is actually green. So all this is work that we started, as I mentioned, in 2018. We recently built further on this with our renewed, so to speak, sustainable finance strategy, which we put out in July this year. And that is, of course, continuing on the 3 work streams that I've already mentioned, but then adding, or maybe rather saying, clarifying even further 4 dimensions, a new dimension, if you wish, which are very important. And I would just mention them very briefly, because I think that the whole world is a little bit struggling with these same challenges. The first one here is the transition, because we are where we are, we know where we want to go, but we also need to find a way to get there. And here, the taxonomy I mentioned before is so important, because taxonomy also needs to be a tool to help this transition, to make sure that we get from where we are today to where we would want to be in terms of climate neutrality by 2050. The second element, which is very important, is the element of resilience in the entire system. And that is something where we believe it's very important that when we look at impact and risks, we recognize the dual relationship between the financial system and the environmental society at large. And that's what we refer to as double materiality. I know that that's a concept which not everyone is entirely convinced of, and not everyone is entirely comfortable with at this point, but we believe that if we want to make this jump to a more sustainable economy, then we really need to have this concept of the double materiality. The third element here I want to highlight, because it's a very important one, and that is the inclusiveness. I think gone are the days where you could say that taking action on climate change is something that can be reserved for the big companies and no one else. This really has to be an effort where everyone is involved, and that is why we need to look in particularly at the needs of the small and medium-sized undertaking, but also looking, of course, at citizens, at the public at large. And that is something that we are currently really working very hard on, to see how can we make sure that all these efforts, that they actually are inclusive, and that we reach everyone in society, because basically we are at the point now where no one can be left out. And then last but absolutely not least, and certainly not in the context of this panel, and that is the international dimension. Because obviously, as you said very rightly, Sean, we are in this together. If we get the biggest jurisdictions of the world to walk in the same direction, that would be extremely helpful for the world at large. And that is the reason why we launched back in 2019 already the International Platform for Sustainable Finance. Now, back then, I think the context was slightly different than is today. I think the general realization that we need to do something, the whole world needs to do something, was not as strong back then as it is now. The good news is that in the meanwhile, this has changed. We have now 17 global partners in this international platform. That means that we cover together, these jurisdictions, about 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions and almost 55% of global GDP, 50% of the world's population. So this is a very good start. The platform is not there to constrain anyone. It's really a forum to try to bring together and work together on best practices and best experiences. And that is why we have 2 main work streams now, if you wish. The taxonomies, I referred to it, the common ground taxonomy. Colleagues of mine have discussed that in this conference earlier. And that's the one working, let's say the one work stream, if you wish. And then the second work stream, and I mentioned it already, which is everything linked to disclosure. So it's very much our intention to continue to work in this spirit. we are very happy that our platform is also recognized as a knowledge partner of the G20 work stream on sustainable finance. Very happy, of course, for the co-leadership between our Chinese friends and our American friends. We have the work streams also in the Financial Stability Board. The IFRS Foundation is starting to look at climate reporting. And all these are work streams that we in the European Commission are very, very supportive of and want to continue to be a driving force in. Now, it is obviously not realistic to think that the whole world will do exactly the same thing. So I think we need to have an element of realism here also, and making sure that what we aim for is to have coherent standards, compatible standards, comparable standards. I think that is important for investors worldwide, and as I said, is something that we in the European Commission really look forward to continuing being a driving force in this work. I will stop there. I'm sorry if it was a little bit long, but I thought I would paint a little bit the picture of what we are doing in the EU. Thank you very much.
Great comments, Paulina. Thank you. It's interesting to note that John Morton, Counselor to US Secretary Janet Yellen, said in the interview a few minutes ago that the coherence of data standards and data availability was one of the things they're looking at too, very closely. And of course, we've seen this in China. This is a feature of the IPSF work, the international platform work on taxonomy, the common ground taxonomy. Of course, one of the other things, Xiheng, that John Morton said was that the dialogue with China was open and productive. And, we know there's trade arguments and trade fights going on at a higher level. But when it came down to climate change, green issues, he was very positive and noted when I spoke to him that John Kerry was in China at the time having conversations with the authorities around this, which is great news, I think, for those of us working on this issue. I'm interested in your thoughts on what might be the opportunities between the major economies, and not just in terms of between the major economies, such as trade and so on, but also to work together to support green transitions in other economies around the world, which I know you've looked at a lot. But Jiang, over to you for your comments, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this very meaningful discussion. I agree with the speakers that today the transition to a green and low carbon economy and to strengthen cooperation to reach these goals is a consensus. I think it's also a consensus in China. As you mentioned earlier, that Chinese President Xi Jinping committed in 2020 September that China will peak carbon emission by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And also later on, he further announced updated climate targets for China that by 2030, China's carbon CO2 emissions per unit of GDP will drop by more than 65% compared to 2005, and the share of non-fossil fuel energy in primary energy consumption will reach about 25%. Since these goals has been pledged, carbon peak and carbon neutrality has become the most hotly discussed and topic in China. All local governments, all businesses, they are looking at these goals, and they are trying to make their future plans according to these goals. China has the most important policy guidance on the economic and social development. That is our 5-year plan. So also these targets, the 2030 and 2060 targets, are included in the 14th 5-year plan. And this overarching guidance will guide all business participants to work on their own plans to reach these goals. And also the institutions within Chinese government, led by the vice premier, has been set up to how to divide these goals and how to make this all the actors who are engaged to be aligned. So from my perspective, I think all countries, particularly those who have pledged the carbon neutrality goals, they are bringing the hope to this age that the human will work together to halt the climate change, and this has made the scientific concept to the center stage of our public policy and to the business activities. So I believe this consensus will bring up more collaboration and deepening the cooperation at all levels and among all stakeholders, among governments, as you said, among governments, both China and Europe countries, and China and US, and also China and other developing countries. We have been ramping up this collaboration. We're always very active to participating in this collaboration, and also among businesses and among financial institutions. I personally believe this is very important to all these countries to send clear signals to the business and financial sector. In the end, I think this carbon neutrality or net zero goals have and will bring a strong momentum to a green technology revolution. I firmly believe that it is in the end that we need to make the green technology and low carbon technology accessible, efficient, and I think profitable to the business and to the financial institutions. So I can see a lot of collaborations has been taking place among all excuse me, among all stakeholders, particularly among the businesses. They are very active. We visited a lot of Chinese companies, particularly those who are engaged in the steel industry, in the petrochemical industry. They are very actively setting up their committees to work on their new plans, and they are trying to input more resources in research and business activities that can help them with their own companies with these goals. So I believe we need to give full play of the market to the market to let them deepen their cooperation in technology transfer and in the R&D in new technologies, particularly in the innovative mechanisms to make these technologies available to all countries, particularly to the developing countries. To this end, the Belt and Road Initiative is particularly after 2019, when China has made quite clear that green will be the tone of the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Chinese financial institutions, Chinese investors, and the government planning agencies, they are working hard to promote the green energies, particularly solar and wind energy development in many developing countries, the Belt and Road countries, and trying to speeding up the capacity building for their personnel, for their institutions to promote the green transition of the economy, at the same time to meet their energy needs, because in implementation and in promoting SDGs, we need to remember we need sustainable development, which does not only have environmental targets, but also economic and social targets. In the end, we need to meet the basic needs of people and to gradually help them have a better life with green energy and with the low carbon future. Well, this is my brief ideas.
Thank you. Such a good point. We need to be looking at issues of equitable and fair development as well. It is interesting to note that President Xi Jinping did call at that summit in 2019 in Belt and Road, which I spoke at as well, about to green the Belt and Road. It's taken a while, but it's worth noting that China seems to have stopped supporting coal-fired power plants outside of in the Belt and Road countries over the last 9 months, at the same time as Japan and Korea have also withdrawn their support for that. So we see the change beginning to happen, but we've obviously got to do a lot more. And it would seem to me, and Paulina, perhaps we can pick this up later, is a lot of chance for cooperation, certainly between Europe and China, on the green aspects of the Belt and Road, whilst there's a lot of resistance about cooperation on the broader Belt and Road. So that seems to be an example of the chance to deepen collaboration, in the sense that we need to support the change around all our emerging markets. But I want to go to Rathin, because he's also very strong on the issue of the other issues involved, equitable development, for example. Rathin, we've got this idea of the major economies shifting in concert, but of course we've got to shift in concert in the right kind of way, haven't we? Your thoughts on this topic, please, my friend.
Well, thank you first, Sean, for inviting me in my new capacity as Managing Director, not of the Overseas Development Institute, of just ODI.
Apologies.
Like ICI. We are neither overseas, nor do we actually now work on this antiquarian concept of people sitting in London and developing other places. So we are now a global think tank that works on global affairs with global partners. So with that plug, let me start. Now, so I can do one of two things. I'm going to try and do both. Let me finish off by saying the polite things, and then let me come up with the things that I would think of if my child, or possibly very soon my grandchild, asked me, what did you people in the bigger countries do since 1919 to impact the challenge of my lifetime, which is sustainable transformation? The polite things I have to say, and the pragmatic things I have to say, let me get them out of the way before I move on to what many might consider non-pragmatic. But you see, I'm a public intellectual now, so I have the privilege of being non-pragmatic, but real. Pragmatically, I think there has never been a better time for sustainable finance to be harnessed in the interests of accelerating and completing the sustainability transformation. And that is because of three reasons. The first is, whether you like it or not, rich people with high per capita energy needs are able to continue to meet their lifestyles, more or less as they were in the 1980s, possibly better, with cleaner, more sustainable energy. A Norwegian can afford, or a Swede, can afford to sit in their shirt sleeves in a heated house when it's minus 20 outside. They don't have to wear overcoats. They don't have to wear fur caps. They can sit in their shirt sleeves. I was just in London yesterday. I went to see my niece, and she was using a heated swimming pool. Well, the good news is no one cares, because the swimming pool is heated using renewable energy. So that's fine, right? In other words, the challenge that was posed by the Brundtland Commission, which is how do we all consume less energy so that we can save the planet, has been replaced by how do we consume the right types of energy so that we can save the planet. And therefore, on the energy front, I think there's a profitable line of business that would be very well served by finance attaching to it at the macro level, at the meso level, and at the micro level. So I do not think there's any particular hurdle now to finance going to renewable energy in a business case sense. The question of whether you continue to use other types of fuel is essentially a legacy question. And that can be dealt with, I think, fairly efficiently as time goes by, purely through some forms of collective action. And there again, we are helped by the fact that other than possibly Russia, and to some extent America and shale oil, there is no big skin in the game for any major economy in the fossil fuel question anymore. It's a question of energy security for India, for example. There's a question of energy continuity for Germany, for example, or for Poland. But if they're able to solve the employment transition questions, we are okay. So we are getting to sort of a workaday business as usual business case. I think the pandemic has helped, paradoxically, because what the pandemic has done, I'm sure Leslie knows more about this, much more about this than I do, is created a world in which for the first time in my living memory, bond markets are more volatile than equities markets. We've had the most unequalizing and terrible sort of recovery that the world has seen, I would imagine, since the French Revolution. We are producing less and people are making more profits. It's called a profit-led recovery if you want to be polite. It means that people who earn wages earn less, banks earn less return on their capital, but people who actually run stuff make more profits by producing less. The upshot of that has been an upending of the kind of algorithms the financial system can use to assess long-term and medium-term profitability, mainly in terms of uncertainty. And this has confused people, but the one sort of lodestar in this game is actually green and climate financial products, because those are actually linked to real activity on a real-time basis. And they afford people a chance to monitor better what is happening to where fixed income finance is deployed than was previously the case. So the appetite for green, just from that narrow financial markets perspective, should be going up. And the third and final factor, I think, is that in the next 20 or 30 years, both as a result of change in prices and as a result of geopolitics, there is no major emerging economy in the top 8 or 9 that has any skin left in the fossil fuels game. There might be some legacy political skin left in that game. Case of coal, say in Germany, minor extent, very minor. Case of, Brazil, perhaps. Case of the US, perhaps with shale, but it's not big. It's very tractable. And therefore, these are very propitious times to think about accelerating green finance in consonance with the wider agenda of financial integration. So that's the polite news. The not so polite news, and what I will tell my grandchildren, comes from my recent experience of COVID. What have we seen? We have seen a terrible failure to unite to provide what should have been very easy, a global public good called a vaccine, to all in sundry. We have seen vaccine nationalism that has risen to an extent that suddenly made Westphalia sound like it happened yesterday and made me wonder whether we ever had a United Nations movement in 1947. This is as true of India or China as it was of Europe or America, and that is the fascinating thing. You can't pin this to sort of Western imperialism or anything like that. Everyone has gone back to petty, ill-informed nationalism. And therefore, I think with the climate challenge, and when we talk about international cooperation, what we have been doing across our lifetimes, and we have to confess to our grandchildren, is that we have been trying to deal with the global problem while pretending that having independent nation states is not a barrier, is not a hindrance, but is actually a facilitator of this problem. Right? And that problem is only enhanced in its nature, in its scope and in its substance. Because one of the reasons why we are seeing so much nationalism, in my view, political nationalism, we are seeing it in the US, we are seeing it in the country I'm sitting in now, the UK. We just had Brexit. We are going to see it in a scattering of countries in Europe. We are seeing it in China to an extent I've never seen in my life. Of course, we are seeing it in India, and so on and so forth. Is that it's quite common if you're a student of history. When you have rampant, continuous inequality on the rise, nationalism, petty nationalism, is an outcome. And that is what you're seeing. And so I think the biggest failure so far has been marked to me by the biggest climate success, which is why is it that it is only in the energy sector, or in substantial measure in the energy sector, that the climate revolution has succeeded? Partly, of course, it is to do with the political economy, which is, Swedes sitting in their shirt sleeves using clean energy. But also partly has to do with the fact that the energy transition is a profoundly unequalizing transition. Whether it is in terms of jobs, whether it is in terms of technologies, whether it is in terms of access to energy, these questions have either been left indifferent in the energy transition or have made matters worse. And it is for this reason that we talk very little about things like agriculture and the built environment when we talk climate, and we talk so much about energy. With the paradoxical result, including in my country, and of course in this country, in the UK, companies like BP and Shell are going to be tomorrow's clean energy barons, having been dirty energy barons. So the climate transition has been seamless for the fossil fuel companies. I'm not impressed by Tesla. What's Tesla? Another company that manufactures private cars, run by another man who invests things in grand frivolous schemes like going to the moon, which is, by the way, profoundly bad for the climate if you actually examine the technologies underlying it. So our patterns of behavior as humans on the globe, as elites on the globe, have not changed. And therefore, what we have done is we have given the lowest priority to climate changes that involve resilience, as I see it, and transition justice. This will need to change, and I do not see how it is going to change. This will need to change in agriculture. This will need to change in the built environment. This will need to change in focusing not just on the source of energy, but also on the consequences of things like pollution in developing countries. And I simply do not see enough global policy attention being given to these matters. If that were not depressing enough, my penultimate point, it is very curious to me, and this is partly because of this shut-eye, do no evil, the three monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil attitude of the climate ecosystem, the climate policy ecosystem. Well-meaning guys, but there is this, let's pretend that things are not as bad as they are. One of the biggest environmental polluters, one of the biggest climate polluters in the world is the defense industry. And there is a profound silence on the fact that the world is rearming itself at levels which are staggering. In the continent I come from, Asia, we have more aircraft carriers now in the Asian seas than we have had since before the Second World War. Okay, we have 16 aircraft carriers in that sea. We have an arms race going on between China and everybody else. All that means is that you're seeing a profound increase in one of the dirtiest industries in the world and one of the most profitable. So that sort of geopolitics, I put to you, is not going to be very good for climate change, just as the defenestration of Afghanistan or the dehumanization of Syria is not good for climate change, which is why we never discuss climate change in Afghanistan or Syria anymore, do we? So we have to take account of these very troubling things that are happening in the world around us. And I would put it to you that these will be constraints, not just on financing for climate change, but on the very prioritization of the climate challenge itself. The world is not moving to a happy place anymore. And I think looking forward in a conference like this, while having acknowledged the good things that are happening in the business as usual world, it is very important for us to learn from the pandemic, learn from the rearming of the world that is going on, understand the forces of divisive nationalism that are confronting us everywhere, and look at the number of countries that are actively suffering and incorporate these into our view on how we can cooperate internationally so we can cooperate inter alia on climate change to build a better world. Because it will have to be inter alia, because I put it to you that given what I've just said about the big picture and what I'm going to tell my grandchildren, that essentially you're going to inherit a world far worse than the one I grew up in, you are not going to be able to deal with climate change and a better sustainable future, ceteris paribus, from these very real geopolitical and global dangers that the world confronts today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rathin. Provocative thoughts. The issue of inequality is something we've spoken to the Climate Bonds Initiative many times, and a critical issue to address if we are to be resilient in the face of shocks. Xiheng, I'll come back to you in a minute, but I just want to flag that President Xi Jinping has made a number of very important speeches about the need to address inequality in China in the last few months with tax policy, lifting the wages of the poor and so on. You might want to bring that into question because you've looked so much at emerging market issuance. But first I need to go to Leslie, who's been patiently waiting here. On the international institutions, I want to pick up that point. I said in my keynote speech a couple of days ago that we cannot survive climate change without deeper collaboration on all of the issues, such as the vaccines issues. We need to increase our global resource allocation to these questions and our work, because otherwise we will implode. Well, Leslie, you're working in one of those institutions, the New Development Bank. The bank. Your reflections, please.
Thank you very much, Sean, for this opportunity. And it's been a fascinating conversation so far. And thanks specifically to you for your leadership that you have demonstrated over the years in this space. I agree with most of the comments, almost all of the comments that have been made so far. But I'd like to offer a perspective from kind of an emerging market lens. But I'd like to start where Rathin sort of left off, and I agree wholeheartedly with them, that COVID has exposed a number of contradictory sort of moments, if you like. I mean, at one level, there are a series of positives we can take from the last 18 months. Firstly, as you know, there's been this heightened public awareness and consciousness around the climate crisis. It's manifested in many surveys, not just amongst millennials, but more broadly. HSBC has done a major survey towards the end of last year and several other institutions. The second major sort of cultural shift that has happened is in the financing industry. Your large institutional investors, as you know, with north of $100 trillion in size. If you look at the leaders in the pack there, you look at BlackRock and the last CEO letter by Larry Fink, January this year, indicating very strongly, starting out with his first statement that climate risk is investment risk, and ESG is now almost, or will become, this sort of de facto default portfolio when it comes to strategic asset allocation in the future. So that's another major trend that is happening. The third major cultural shift or trend that is happening is amongst regulators. Now, there's a downside, as we heard from Paulina, with the proliferation of taxonomies and so on, green standards, but there's so much innovation taking place today. I mean, people are here in China looking at PBOCs, looking at People's Bank of China, at macroprudential, greening the macroprudential regulation system. What that effectively means is that when you look at financial stability, when you look at the banking system, how can you put additional capital charges on banks who lend more to the fossil fuel industry? So there's a lot of positives that one could take from those three major forces at work. And the fourth major, very positive trend that is unfolding now that I think will potentially change our entire system of accumulation or capitalism as we know it, is that what 2050 has done, or what net zero commitment has done, it has shifted the lenses more long-term. You have to take a longer-term view because business models have to change, new approaches have to be developed, and net zero has really kind of shifted the lenses of corporations throughout the world, who typically are very much driven by short-term profitability. Governments are driven by 4-5-year electoral cycles. So the positives that I would take out of this current period are those forces. I'd like to, though, endorse what Rathin has said, is that the institutions that we have set up to act in a counter-cyclical manner in moments like what we have experienced during COVID have not really lived up to that mandate. I've just put an opinion piece in Financial Times yesterday arguing that multilateral development banks could have done and can do so much more with a little bit of financial engineering. So in short, without going into the detail, I just want to say that there's a need to go back to the drawing boards to look at the overall architecture. The core architecture of multilateral institutions was really codified way back in Bretton Woods. Not much has changed. We might not see it like that, but the core financial constructs of these institutions have pretty much remained the same. The third point I'd like to make, though, is that when you look at emerging markets, I come from South Africa, and Africa, as you know, contributes less than 4% of global emissions. As we know, the three power blocks in the world, China 28%, Europe 15%, or the combination of the three biggest power blocks, the US, Europe, and China, constitutes more than half of global emissions. And by definition, they have to play a leadership role, and they are playing a very strong leadership role, especially the European Union, China, and the United States. In each of those three cases, I mean, the Green Deal has obviously raised the bar in terms of climate policy, but there's one or two issues that I want to sort of flag in that regard. And maybe Paulina later can give some reflections on that. The first point I'd like to make is that we need to reach a global consensus around what a new green trading system could look like. And it cannot be crafted in the Commission or in Europe as much as this, as I said, we might have to commend the leadership role that European Union and the Commission is playing. But, you know, we live in a much broader world, and we already have some of the emerging markets, China, Brazil, South Africa, having expressed some concerns about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, saying that this could be potentially discriminatory in terms of WTO rules. So I think it's important to craft the principles of a new green trading system in partnership with the emerging markets. In providing leadership, though, I think it's very important that one is not too far ahead, because if Europe sets very high emission standards and in the process merely shift the production of carbon-intensive industries then go towards emerging markets, it hasn't really sort of solved the essential and core issue. I think, as you know, in 2015, it was a major topic. It still is today. The countries, emerging markets, bear less historic responsibility for the climate crisis, and I think that has to be a principle that is embedded in the way that we look at the future. The second point that I would like to make with respect to the leadership of Europe, and here I think I specifically want to look at what happened in France. As you know, when President Macron announced the increase in fuel levies 2017, it led to major protests which continued for years thereafter. So we have to really guard against a situation where, you know, the concerns around the end of the month, if you like, rather than the end of the world, dominate in public minds, and you could actually have populist movements revolting against the sort of leadership being provided by your big three, that's China, the US, and Europe, because there is the cost of decarbonization, which we have to talk about openly. If you look at South Africa, where I'm from, for example, we've got two major, biggest emitters in South Africa, a company called Sasol, as well as Eskom. Those two companies, Eskom, for example, contributes, something like 90% of our coal, or rather of our energy grid comes from coal. And large numbers of people are employed in those industries. As we decarbonize South Africa's energy system, we already have 34% unemployment in South Africa, right? So we're sitting on a time bomb unless we are able to have a regime where we look at the sort of equity issues, we look at the just transition and factor that into the policies that we design. In short, I guess what I'm saying is that this, as Sean has already indicated, this is a make or break decade, but I am very positive that the current conjuncture creates the opportunity for significant change. I mean, we have seen from John Kerry's statements, Janet Yellen recently convened all the heads of MDBs in private and pretty much gave an indication that they expect MDBs to significantly increase their climate finance targets. We are currently at 40% as New Development Bank. The other MDBs, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, European Investment Bank, are all at 50%. Janet Yellen, or the US Treasury, who's one of the biggest shareholders of the MDB system, is in fact pushing the banks to do more. So we've got a perfect sort of unison of leadership between the three major blocks. But I think it is critical that we bring the emerging markets into this conversation and bring in the issues of equity, bring in the issues of sharing the cost of the decarbonization, so that we don't move too far ahead of the developing countries. And then finally, one of the advantages we had as a new development bank since I've been here over the last 6 years is to go back to first principles, because we were completely new when we started out. I think in a similar way, because of this historic moment we have now, the depth of the crisis, the consciousness amongst regulators, amongst the public at large, there is a readiness to do both things. So I think we have to think out of the box, look at our institutions. At the moment, the G20 is the best we have in giving that multilateral leadership, but I think we should put on fresh lenses to see how we can re-engineer the structures that we have to lead the world through this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leslie. Rathin, you're going to have to pick up that structures in a minute, but I want to go to Paulina first for reactions, reflections, and then Xiheng. Paulina, Europe's really working hard on a leadership position on this, but it's complicated because of the issues involved. Inequality's been an issue within Europe, and Rathin's talking about the substantive inequality issues globally. Your reactions, your thoughts to the agenda they posited. What's your thinking?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come back. And I've listened with a lot of interest to what the other panelists were saying, and I agree with a lot of what has been said, although probably not about with absolutely everything. And I think my overall sense here is also, as so often, is the glass half full or half empty? With some people painting a rather pessimistic image, and others like yourself, Sean, preferring to take things from the positive perspective. And I guess, as so often, that the truth is somewhere in between. A few remarks from my side, or reflection in light of what other panelists have been saying. I think, first of all, obviously Rathin is right to refer to the bigger picture here. I mean, really take the step out, and I'm glad, by the way, that you are feeling better after your unpleasant COVID experience. And that's obviously right. I mean, nothing we do in the world takes place in any kind of isolation. All issues are interlinked, be it the health issues linked to the pandemic, be it, of course, the complicated geopolitical tensions in many parts of the world. And of course, all this has to be seen together, because it all is linked together. So I think that is useful to always remind ourselves of that. At the same time, I think that the climate emergency is really so acute now. So what I wonder a little bit is whether, we don't need to just deal with it anyway. Yes, the world is imperfect, and yes, we have a lot of challenges, and yes, it may well be right that many of the structures of the post-Second World War institutional structures that we put in place in the world are no longer entirely fit for today's world. But what I would be a little bit worried about, and that's, no one has suggested that, but I'm saying just for the sake of the argument, is that we would now say, well, there's so many other issues we need to deal with first, and then let's come back to climate change. So that's why I think, so always, the perfect would be the enemy of the good, and there's basically no time to lose. And that is why we need to basically deal with these various challenges in parallel, although that is very complicated. So that's my first point. The second point, which I think was made very rightly by both Rathin and Leslie, is of course the different challenges in emerging economies compared to let's say more developed economies. I think partly the challenges are the same, but partly they are very different. And I think that is obviously also something that we need to keep in mind when we, in this kind of big global cooperation around these issues, and trying to basically have a methodology and system that kind of can work in countries that obviously start with very different circumstances and with very different tools and possibilities to take actions. I think that point is certainly very, very well made. The third point I want to make is the just transition. I think that is extraordinarily important. I think I referred to it myself in a slightly different way by speaking about the need to be inclusive, but it does boil down to the same thing. Obviously, as was mentioned, there will be impact on jobs. There will be enormous social consequences by trying to tackle climate change heads on, and that is something that we need to really take very, very seriously. It is partly a funding issue, and there I think obviously the let's say the more developed countries need to help the emerging countries, but it goes beyond that, and I think these are clearly challenges that we need to be aware of. Then on the point of looking not only at the energy sector but also at transport, agriculture, the whole marine space, if you wish. I think that's absolutely right. In Europe, we've actually been doing that. That was part of the package around the Fit for 55 proposals that we put forward in July, which precisely also look at agriculture, forestry, and other areas. Of course, you're absolutely right, Rathin, that it's not only about energy. It's much more fundamental than that. Then maybe briefly on carbon border adjustment mechanism, because it was mentioned, just to be very clear that, I think from the EU perspective, it's not a new issue. That's something that the risk of carbon leakage is something that we have been speaking about for quite a while. We see doing something about this as an integral part of the strategy to fight climate change and reach carbon neutrality. Now, where I can clearly, and I want to assure everyone, is that obviously this would be something that would be entirely WTO compliant. What we are looking at here is not in any way to target third countries or specific third countries, but basically looking at very energy intensive goods. And it's certainly obviously something that we want to continue to engage with all our global partners. Final point from my side, and that is I think it was kind of alluded to that there is a risk that, let's say, richer regions, run off so fast that it's difficult for others to follow. I think, yes and no. This has to be a very coordinated and global effort, and I think the various work streams that we have been discussing are absolutely essential in that context. At the same time, and I'm a little bit closing the circle and coming back to my first remark, I think that we have such a climate emergency, and we see it, here in Europe, but also elsewhere, almost every week, with floodings, with forest fires, with temperatures that have never been seen on the continent. So I basically think that, again, I think those who can will have to try to move quickly, but obviously making sure that others are coming along. And as I said, I think this is a global effort that we need to continue to pursue together. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you for those incredibly useful comments. Xiheng, I'd like to go to you, if I can, for your reactions and reflections. You've done so much work on developing aid, support for the Green Belt and Road and so on. But of course, domestically in China, the issue of inequality is very live, as President Xi Jinping has led to him making a number of important policy statements. What are your reactions, thoughts as a result of the other speakers so far?
Well, I think other speakers have also emphasized we need to have a just transition to a green and low carbon world. And personally, I always believe that it is the technology, the green technology revolution that is happening in many developed countries, but how to ensure that other developing countries will not be left behind in this new revolution. So we need to make sure that they can have access to these technologies and they can afford to have these technologies. When we are talking about this, we need to to bring together the power and the strengths of the market, the governments, and the public, so we can make this technology accessible and affordable. Like what we have been emphasizing, the clean and affordable energy is fundamental to this change, because yes, and also other speakers mentioned that the energy sector, the transportation sector, the other industry sectors, plus the architecture sector, they are the key sectors that contribute to the carbon emission. So in all these sectors, there are a lot of technologies in the hands of developed countries, but they are more expensive. And how can we bring down the cost of these technologies? We need big markets. just like what happened in the past, that for the solar, we can remember clearly that for the solar panels, they were invented in Germany, but they were too costly for other developing countries. But when Chinese companies, they have been speeding up their development of this technology, they make these technologies a lot cheaper. And in this way, China and other developing countries, they can afford to use solar energy. So nowadays, the Chinese companies, they have bring down the cost of solar energy, the wind energy, and they are working hard to bring down the cost of other green technologies. So I think we need to, I always think that we should give incentives for companies to input in the innovation of these technologies. So we need to ensure that they got their fair share of the profits, but also we need to use the market, the big markets of developing countries, like the market in China and in India and in other developing countries, to make this costs, the cost of these technologies cheaper and cheaper. In the end, all countries, they are not left behind. They could have access to these technologies. For aid, ideally, I think aid, because this government resource should be a leverage to help the market and to help the financial institutions. Financial institutions, they are looking for profit. Of course, they should have a fair expectation of the profit. We have this, the financial business sector. We also have the public development banks, and we have the multilateral development banks. We have aid. All these financial tools should be considered in a coordinated way. So the aid, if we could describe the cost drop as ladders, then each stakeholder could contribute to a share. Then in the end, the cost could be lowered down. So I think countries, particularly the MDBs like New Development Bank and other MDBs, they should consider how to build up this mechanism to pool the resources, the financial resources from the government's aid, the policy banks, the MDBs, and also the business sector. Actually, of course, we have been hearing a lot about how to leverage the public, use the public finance to leverage private institutions. But actually, I think we haven't really find a good solution to play the role of this leverage. I think this could be an area to strengthen efforts and to strengthen cooperation, to help all stakeholders. They can deliver what they have committed. So thank you.
It's a really good point, and I think it is worth noting strong state action in Germany in 2001, thanks to a Green Labour government, Green SPD government, led to the beginning of the rapid reduction in cost of solar, picked up by the Chinese government with mass procurement, volume procurement, which drove down the price. There's an issue of technology transfer. I know Rathin's always been concerned about that, but nevertheless, the world has gained an extraordinary benefit as we now see solar prices getting to unbelievably low levels and continuing to go down. We can share this idea. One of the areas we're talking about tomorrow is hydrogen, green hydrogen, which will end up being produced in the warmer countries of the world. And I noticed that Prime Minister Modi has pushed the green hydrogen strategy. The German government, the European Commission has pushed the green hydrogen strategy. But it will require a larger market that is likely to be able to be provided in any one country if we're going to get the volume and the price change rapidly enough to displace the gas that we're currently using. And this is, for me, one of the areas where the green window could work. How can we have deeper collaboration on, let's say, green hydrogen, but in many areas, between China, which has got some fantastic companies developing lower cost green electrolyzers, between India and Saudi Arabia and Algeria, who have got the irradiation capacity to be able to produce, let alone the demand in these markets, and of course Europe, which needs the green hydrogen to be able to transform its industries. How do we work together on this? And I guess a question to you, Rathin, trade policy, trade agreements. Can we move towards aggressive cooperation which also addresses fairness about this and a fair return? I want to just draw attention to how the US built out its electricity network in the 1950s. It didn't do it with free market economies and letting people make humongous profits. It did it with capacity remuneration. Companies were told they can get a 6% return, at that point a very good return, if they build capacity, but only 6%. That was it. On the capex involved, they could build more if they wanted and try and sell it to the market. Through that process, a fair return at the time, we saw a massive growth in electricity generation development in the US, fossil fuels, of course, at the time. This issue of fair remuneration that Xiheng raises, I think, is an extremely interesting point in a world where capital is dominated by pension funds and insurance funds and holding capitals, rather than the Goldman Sachses of the world, with full or full credit to Leslie's past in the commercial sector. How could we make this work, Rathin? We have an opportunity. What have we got to do? What's the agenda look like to get fair trade, but also trade that creates larger markets that can drive down price? What do you see as the agenda? You're on mute, my friend. Still can't hear you. Oh, now we go.
There is no such thing, I would submit to you, as free trade.
Okay.
I mean, other than Oxfam and Tanzania and fair trade coffee and all that, there is unfair trade, which is heavily state subsidized. And there is trade that is unfair, which is heavily not state subsidized. But in the end, especially if you're talking about energy sources, you make money. You make money from fossil fuels. And my life has taught me, and I should tell my grandchildren, that the business of renewable energy is hugely profit-making for people like Elon Musk, who then go and buy their way into space and do other such things that very rich people do. For Mr. Ambani, for Mr. Adani. So let's not fool ourselves. And this has always been a major contradiction, in these events, where at one level we talk about this being a public good and a climate emergency. The other level, what I see and what my grandchildren see, is a lot of people making a lot of money out of this. And that's okay. Let's just be honest about it. That fair return thing you're talking about, Sean, in 1950 was a very different world. There simply wasn't the aggregation of finance that you're seeing now. The US wanted to build capacity. The risks that had to be taken were very high, and therefore they offered a minimum baseline rate of return. And then let Stanvac and everyone else do business with the Saudis to make lots of money. So I'm afraid we're not going to get a fair world by making access to technology more cheaply available. I think Jiang's point was quite interesting about developing countries. Let's imagine for a moment a world in which developing countries do not have access to affordable green technology. What will they do? Either they will become terribly unproductive, because not having access to affordable green technology means you're going to use less productive technologies and therefore build things more expensively, which will make your country's non-tradable sector more expensive and effectively nullify any chance of exports, right? Or you will get a two-step world, a dirty world and a clean world. And you'll be bargaining with the dirty world because unlike human beings, unfortunately, pollution and these things cross borders, and it's very difficult to get the Home Office to prevent them from crossing. So you can keep poor people out of rich countries. You can't keep poor countries that produce pollution or bad greens out of rich countries. So then you'd have to do a bargain with them every year to make sure that they don't, the spillover effects are maintained. That is the world you're going to look at. So quite sensibly, what has happened is that has been preempted, and there is a public good move to try and supply green technologies better. I think the point that, again, Jiang made about China is very important, that it is undoubtedly true that were it not for China, today we would not have had a solar revolution. It is also, unfortunately, and I must say this to you, madam, true that that has not come through pure altruism. China has extracted its price. I should know. I'm from India. And that price, again, comes back to the point I'm making, which is you're dealing with countries that are increasingly, not just China, the US, the UK, Europe, parts of Europe, India, Brazil, that are moving, that are reversing into hyper-nationalist mode. And that hyper-nationalism is going to give you outcomes that are very dangerous and are going to derail action on climate change, just like it is derailing action on peace and security. And until that is incorporated, we are going to have a problem. That is the real problem with inequity. The inequity problem is not that there are some poor people living in slums or people are going to get unemployed by coal. It is that inequity has become systematized. Inequity is so systematized that today you do not need the government to do the job of financing big transformations. You have Goldman Sachs to do it, to intermediate it, and you have the pension funds that aggregate the savings of old people in rich countries and deliver them to poor countries. So that system of financial aggregation, which is tremendously unequalizing, already exists. And I think that the only limited point I'm trying to make, I completely respect what my colleague from the EU say. She's right. This cannot be considered to be an insuperable barrier. Is that this needs to come into the front and center of the finance conversation. We cannot finance a sustainable transformation with increased geopolitical nationalism, increased military spending, going on and pretend that that was not happening and then look at the opportunities. It just ain't going to work. So we will have to bring these things to the front and center of the campaigning we do for our common sustainable future, which means we'll have to talk about green and what allows green to sustain, survive, and thrive. And that's simply not happening.
Great point, Rathin. Leslie, cue to you.
Thank you very much. What a fascinating conversation. I wish we had an hour or two more. I am sort of less pessimistic around the potential for a green trading system to emerge anytime soon. Implicit in our conversation over the last hour, 15, 20 minutes or so, have been the view that the world will run on these parallel tracks. Let's acknowledge that at the moment there are deep tensions that reflected and manifested in technology, trade tensions with respect to geopolitical issues, whether it's Xinjiang, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea. There's a whole series of tensions between the United States and China, as well as European Union and China. But we are in our conversation that we've had over the last hour, so we assume that the world will be able to run on these parallel tracks where we can deepen collaboration in terms of the climate agenda, and these three power blocks, as we already all acknowledge, are indeed playing that leadership role, and somehow we can, sort of coexist with these two worlds. However, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the principles of a new green trading system have to be defined, and we do not have an enabling environment for that. We've already heard a very powerful set of arguments that Rathin has just advanced, suggesting that this rise of nationalism is a major sort of counteracting force. And that comes to my earlier point I made around we need to find all of the tools and the necessary ways to cement and deepen the multilateral institutions, who's our best hope. They were set up after the chaos of the 1930s, after the emerging out of 1944 Bretton Woods. We created the IMF, the World Bank, and after that, United Nations, World Trade Organization, and so on. All of these institutions have served us well over the last 70 years, but they have reached limits in many respects. So the far-sighted elements within China, within the United States, and within Europe, our best bet right now, who can reinforce these multilateral institutions to help us define what a level playing field could look like and what a green trading system could look like. But in the midst of the current tensions, Sean, I'm less hopeful. One can only sort of hope that the political winds having changed in the United States with John Kerry, the Biden administration, Janet Yellen. These are all people deeply committed to the climate agenda. But we have short electoral cycles. Next year, you have midterm elections. You could have the Congress swing again in the United States, and you could maybe have political change in 2024. So we could very, very quickly see, the other power blocks in the United States potentially not being in alignment with the rest of the world. In short, I do want to leave on my remarks on a positive note. I tried to paint the picture earlier on. As you said in the theme of the session, it's a green window. 2021 has the potential to really unlock the major changes that needs to be made. As you correctly pointed out, we have these 8 years to engineer the sort of most of the countries who have targets towards peak emissions. I think that Glasgow could be that moment. That could be a historic turning point. It's certainly already been sort of proposed that it could indeed have that impact when most of the countries at Glasgow hopefully will sign up to net zero, and that could drive a broader public and popular movement, civil societies, business, governments, all being aligned to this much more longer term agenda. As I said earlier on, our system, the way we live, everything is geared towards the short term. What net zero has done for all of us is really shifted our lenses, as Rathin said, towards what will be the nature of the planet that our grandchildren will live in. Thank you.
And that's the acid question, isn't it? What kind of planet do we want our children to live in? And that's something we need to bear in mind in all our countries. So this conversation is very important. Folks, we're coming towards the end. I'm going to ask you for some summary thoughts. Paulina, I'm going to end up with you, if that's all right. We work so closely in the European Commission. I'm keen to hear your reflections on every comments. I'd like to go to Xiheng first and then Rathin, just in terms of where you think this takes us. And I resolutely take a glass half full rather than a glass half empty approach. Paulina, you're perfectly correct. But one has to acknowledge the glass half empty here to be able to understand what to do. Xiheng, you've done so much work on Belt and Road, on development issues, on greening the world through this work. Give us your final reflections, your thoughts on how to go forward, including on cooperation and trade, or especially on cooperation and trade. We do seem to have an opportunity, I think.
Personally, I think Rathin has emphasized a lot about nationalism, I always believe that it is true that, as Adam Smith said, the bakers they made the bread not for altruism, but I welcome. I think this kind of competition, no matter for what, for national strength or for other purpose, the competition on the level field for green technology development, and for the for cheap green tech. Well, I don't want to say cheap. It's for I would like to see a world. Personally, I would like to see a world that all countries are competing for green and affordable technologies. So that will make this world a better place, rather than competing for the military power or for other things. So I hope the countries and the international organizations, they could facilitate this fair competition on this front.
Great points. Rathin, thank you.
How could I possibly disagree? That would be indeed a better place, but the fact remains that we are not there. And therefore, I think there are three things that we could do in terms of the advocacy that organizations such as Climate Bonds and Convenes does, which is to try and point out that investment in green technologies actually contributes to global security. And it does so by being completely fair cross-border. I don't know where the taxonomy debate has come, but if you have a common set of rules that are explicit and transparent, which everyone buys into for a particular financing venture, then that would be very unusual, right, Leslie, in the world of finance. Normally, you look at Mozambique and you have one set of rules for them and you have one set of rules for Belgium. If you can do that with climate bonds, then that would have a salutary impact on the basic proposition that the world is essentially very similar in its nature and intent. The second, I think, is we have to have this conversation sometime. It will not happen in the G20. The G20 is a fluffy place. But we will have to have this conversation at least in intellectual space, which is, are you going to achieve a sustainable transformation by some people making a lot of money, or do you have a better idea? It's very clear that you can achieve a sustainable transformation by making Elon Musk and another 10 Elon Musks very rich. I keep mentioning him because when I'm going to tell my grandchild that one of the beneficiaries of green and sustainable transformation was a guy who made motor cars, except he made them with using sustainable fuel and made so much money that he could actually afford to send himself to the moon, they're going to wonder what kind of world we were running. So that's an epistemic choice I think the world has to make. That are we going to go into a situation where we collaborate for the good of the many and therefore deliberately decide not to have the usual pathway to transformational results that the world has seen, which is to get the result, which is clean energy and clean motor cars, but with increased inequality. That is, I think, the big epistemic challenge going forward. And the third and final challenge, I think, for the whole world is to when is the world of green finance going to take the remilitarization of the world as a clear emerging threat to world prosperity and sustainable development? I would really like to see the world stop pretending that militarization, unprecedented since the time of Nazi Germany, not even the Cold War, since the time of Nazi Germany, is compatible with the kind of sustainable and green future and the tackling of the climate emergency that I think my colleagues in Europe and here in the UK would like to see. The two worlds cannot coexist beyond a point. We have to give up this schizophrenia. And I think this point has to be raised, as it often is, by the way, when you have geopolitical threats, by the very powerful world of finance. And I think we can do a lot if we shape our attentions at least partially in that direction. Thank you.
Very interesting point about the potential role of finance and in my language, capital, to try and influence this agenda going forward. You mentioned the taxonomy. I mean, one of the things we do have, by the way, is we have a global, largely consistent market of green and sustainable bonds approaching 2 trillion using broadly the same criteria. And this will be reinforced by the forthcoming publication of the Common Ground taxonomy between China and Europe that the European Commission and the People's Bank of China have been working on. And we already see lower volatility, better prices for green bonds and green investments across the world compared to vanilla. Great for National New Development Bank's green bond program. They're actually coming across as a better investment, and partly because they represent lower risk, because these are things that are less likely to be impacted negatively by the change we're going into. But the main point is they perform better in downturns. Every time there's a downturn, green bonds hold their value. Investors consider them a premium product. And that's, I think, the first part of what you're talking about, Rathin, which is a common cross-border understanding of what we need to do from the financial markets, supported, of course, by regulators in many countries. It's a very interesting thought. And I just want to say, I agree with Rathin about Elon Musk, because it's mass transit that we really need, densification of cities. Hey, I want green cars, I want electric cars, but I want a lot more electric railways and electric buses and denser cities going forward. But hey, that's my view. Paulina, your reflections. And Leslie, I want a last word for you about the glass half full aspect to get us out an optimistic note, because it's a tough conversation. But Paulina, you're in this extraordinary position in the Commission of trying to craft some of the policy initiatives and the international cooperation around the financial agenda going forward. Where are you at now? What are your thoughts about the agenda going forward?
Thank you, Leslie, and I will keep it very brief because unfortunately also I have to drop off this call because I have another speaking engagement. I want to thank everyone because I think this was extremely interesting, and clearly we could have continued this discussion for a couple of hours. Like Leslie, I have to say, would like to finish a little bit on a positive note. I was going to say something, but actually Rathin made exactly that point, although maybe his conclusion from it was slightly different. And that's the fact that, of course, the climate emergency is also directly linked to global security. And I think Rathin made that point very eloquently. And the conclusion I would personally draw from that is that at some point these potentially kind of parallel tracks that we may be moving on will have to come together for that very reason. And I think that is why, also from my perspective, I think let's say that the glass is more half full than half empty. World of finance absolutely has to be front and center in this. I think they actually already are, for the simple reason that public funding is not enough to make this transition. In my day job, I speak to a lot of financial institutions, and I think there is a very, very high involvement and engagement in this compared to just what the situation was a couple of years ago. So from that point of view, also, I think we are on the right track. Thank you so much for inviting me again to this panel, and a very good continuation to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. Leslie, 5 seconds. Last word.
Thank you very much. There are some very exciting developments underway. I know Rathin said that G20 is a fluffy organization, but they're currently doing significant work around how to unleash the real latent firepower and potential of multilateral institutions to specifically deal with the climate crisis. So I would definitely want to sort of end on a note of optimism that the lenses of the world are very much focused on how to generate significantly new and more financial resources towards the sustainability agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiheng. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Rathin. Thank you, Paulina. Been a wonderful session. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on now to our next session in a minute. Thank you for joining us. Remember, this has been recorded. We may even spin off some articles about some of these, but above all, if you've been listening to this, take this conversation back to your worlds, to your sectors, to the finance, to the policymaker sector. We need change. We need to address inequality, not just greenness. We need to address defence, as Rathin says. We need to bring all of things together into an agenda about how we sustainably manage the planet, how we become conscious stewards of the planet. Thanks for joining me in this session.